What is going on, everyone? So this week's video is going to be my composition review with my images, or my image, from my spring of 2022 backpacking trip to the canyons of southern Utah. Now, usually during these videos, I'll go through all the photos I shot that I'm quite happy with, and I'll share my thoughts on the composition, why I did what I did, and why I think it was successful or wasn't successful. But in this case, I only have one photo, and this is actually a unique opportunity because it gives me an opportunity to talk a little bit more in depth about this image and share some of my scouting images of the scene. A lot of times when there are videos where people talk about composition, there's a tendency to put lines over it and explain things, and this is a great way of explaining things after the fact, but it doesn't necessarily explain what it is that we're thinking about as we're in the field and as we're approaching a subject. So first of all, this photo was taken on Provia 100F film. It was taken with a Tiffin 81B warming filter to add just a little bit of warmth to the scene. And it basically didn't take much editing at all, just a slight tweak of the curves for some added contrast, because Provia actually has some pretty decent dynamic range. And also there's one rock right here that I darkened just a little bit because it stood out a little bit too much. So let's talk about this subject. So this is a subject I discovered pretty close to where I was camping that particular night. And I found this on my trip the year before. I have a tendency when I go on these trips to just wander around all day long. Even at the end of the day, I am back at camp. I just can't still. I can't sit still. I have to pace around, move around, climb around, and look for things. And that's when I found this, by climbing up this particular slope. And I really loved the look of this juniper tree. But when I found it last year, I could not find a way to photograph it. And even on this particular visit, it took me a while to finally figure out which angle it looked best from. And so when I'm out on the trips, one thing I'll do is I'll use my phone to take scouting pictures of the scene. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you some of these scouting photos. I'm going to show you what it is that attracted me to the scene and what my thought process was for finalizing this particular composition. And then I'll go over in more detail specifically what I was thinking of when I was composing it. So let's start with the first photo of that particular tree from my scouting images. And this was taken from a bit of a different angle. And although I really liked the look of this tree, and I was trying to find a composition that more or less centered it against the sandstone, but it wasn't working because there's a branch on the left side that wasn't very symmetrical, and it really looked off. And so when you have a very centered composition of a subject, it's very important to have relatively strong symmetry of that subject. And it just was looking off. So my next approach was to perhaps zoom in on it, use the equivalent of a longer lens to photograph it, this time vertically, and see if I can have a different aspect to that image. And that too fell short. If anything, it only made that branch off to the left side look a little bit more awkward. Though it did give me a little bit more detail in terms of the texture of the background. My next approach was to back up further, zoom in, and go horizontal. And this allowed me to get a bit more of this band of light sandstone here. I'm at a little bit of a lower angle just because of the slope that I was on. But again, we have this branch on that left side that was troublesome, and it just didn't work very well for a centered composition. Then I backed up a little bit further, and I went with a vertical composition and trying to see if I could have that tree within its setting. And so there's a ridge in the foreground, there are some plants and some soil, and although, yeah, it kind of works, it's also a little bit cluttered, and it just doesn't really have, it's not as clean of a composition as I was hoping for. And at this point, I decided to move closer to the tree. And so I moved closer and tried to see if I could, again, find a somewhat centered composition, though I found that from this angle, the branch off to the left really wasn't quite as distracting. And also as I got closer, I realized that a centered composition isn't really going to work for this tree. And the reason for that is it has a little bit of a bias where it curves up and toward the right. And so in that case, having the tree a little bit more toward the left side of the composition was going to make it balance better. And the foreground was starting to emerge here. There are some interesting little yucca type plants in the foreground. There are some cryptobiotic soil. And it was looking better than before, but it still wasn't quite there. So I tried a couple different variations of that, taking a slight step one direction or another. And again, just playing with this particular composition. And I should say that this whole time, what I'm using is the Artist View Catcher, which is this plastic frame. So I'm looking through it, find something that's pretty decent, and then I'd use my phone to just replicate that just for my own memory. So I was working the scene using the Artist View Catcher, using my iPhone, and it was only when I took a step back that now I have some bare sandstone in the foreground, and then also we begin to see this triangular shape. And so once I saw that, I realized I was a little bit more onto something. You can see that my scouting photos now are starting to get fairly close to the look of the final image. And then I took a step back a little bit further, kind of worked with it from there. It was at that point that I realized that this is more or less where I need to put my camera. And it was a little bit tricky because the area I need to put my camera was right on the edge of a sandstone drop off, and it dropped off maybe 8 feet or so. So I was able to get the composition the way that I wanted to. Now let's talk a little bit more in detail about what it was I was thinking as I was setting up this composition. So since this tree moves a little bit, has a little bit of a motion toward the right, I knew that I needed to have it a little bit more off to the left. Now this works pretty well because we have a little bit of asymmetry with this branch over here, though from this particular angle, you do have a bit more of a uniform shape than the other scouting shots I showed you initially, where you have this branch sticking out at a really weird angle from the left side. So we have the tree a little bit off to the left, angling a bit more into the composition. And then we have this shape right here, which is a little bit more toward the right. So you have the visual weight of this and the visual weight of this right here. And I was trying to find that perfect harmony by moving the camera a little bit left, right, and try to figure out how to get these things to balance the best. One thing I did with this scene, which you will not really be able to tell from this, is that there's still something a little bit off about this scene. And since this tree naturally leaned a little bit this way, I actually took the whole camera and I rotated it just a little bit. And by doing that, I was able to better balance the tree against this, but also this sandstone here, this lighter section of sandstone here, this becomes a little bit more level with the top of the composition, which I think was one of the things that I was having difficulty visually leveling this composition, because this line was a little bit off. And there's no real reference point for what is a true vertical in this scene. So that's why having the camera angled just a little bit allowed me to calm the image a little bit, while also, I think, building a little bit more of the dynamic of this versus this. When I am setting up a composition on the ground glass, one of the really fun things about 8x10 is, much like looking at the print here, you can actually measure things with your fingers. So on the ground glass, I was taking this distance and more or less making sure it's fairly similar to that distance there. So from the green to the edge, the green to the edge. And at that point, I was now looking at how much space I had down here. And I was pretty good. I want to make sure I have enough breathing room in the foreground, because for me, that's one of my number one regrets when it comes to a composition, is wishing I had just a little bit more foreground. I wanted to lessen the visual tension of this triangular shape approaching the bottom of the composition, because the less foreground you have, the more visual tension you build there. So by having enough extra space down here, it really helps to reduce the visual tension. And I mentioned earlier that the one thing I did to this is that there's a rock right here, which is fairly near the edge of the composition. And originally it looked a little bit more like this rock. It was a little bit lighter in tone. And having that light colored rock right near the edge of the composition was enough to create it was a minor distraction, but it was the sort of thing that attracted your attention there, even if you didn't quite realize why it was that your attention was attracted to this side of the composition. So I used a curves layer and just darkened down that particular rock to pull the attention away from that. Because otherwise, my first instinct with this photo was to crop a little bit off the right side, which was okay. But then also I had to lose a little bit of room elsewhere on the composition. So overall, I am very satisfied the way that this turned out. And hopefully it was interesting for you to see the scouting photos, to see the specific thought process with regard to where exactly I should set up the camera and to get the exact sort of composition that has the calm feeling. But this is definitely a photo I really do enjoy, and it really does give the feeling I had as I shot that particular morning. But I want to thank everyone for watching, and also if you haven't already, please tune into the podcast Creative Banter. You'll find it linked down below in the show notes. Just like this, it too is ad-free. But I want to thank everyone for watching. We'll see you around next time.